There is one term that has gone viral since the indictment of Sean Diddy Combs more than anything else. It is called a freak-off.
Combs abused, threatened, and coerced victims to fulfill his desires.
Deep beneath Diddy's mansion, a hidden tunnel was discovered filled with bizarre artifacts and walls scratched with chilling messages. For Michael, the night guard, this was no ordinary find. It was a doorway into something sinister. What those dark, twisted passageways held was a question he would soon know the answer to. Could the stories of hidden rituals and forbidden meetings really be true? Tune in as we uncover the terrifying truth lurking in the depths of Diddy's underground maze that confirms his diabolic origins. Shadows beneath the mansion's luxury. On his first shift, everything seemed over-the-top fancy. Marble floors, massive crystal chandeliers, paintings worth more than Michael had ever made in his life, and of course, the unmistakable smell of old money. The place screamed wealth. The statues lining the halls almost seemed like they were watching him, their eyes following his every move, giving him a feeling he shrugged off as paranoia. However, one rule stuck out among the mundane instructions he got from his boss. Never, ever go near the basement after midnight. The older supervisor, who looked like he hadn't slept in years, said it with such seriousness that it made Michael pause. There was a hollow, haunted look in the man's eyes that spoke of a reality beyond simple security work. Before we delve into this, it's clear that what Michael found in the basement was far darker than anyone could have expected, and it won't be the only thing that will chill you to the core. The first couple of nights went by uneventfully, checking doors, walking down ornate halls, shining his flashlight into dark corners. But each time he got near the basement, he felt an odd chill, a sense that he wasn't alone. The door was thick, made of heavy wood, and was always locked, but there was something about it, as if the air got colder the closer he got. Still, he followed orders, at least until the third night. It was then, during one of the lavish parties hosted in the mansion, that he noticed a small group of people breaking off from the main crowd, making their way towards the basement. They came back about an hour later, their expressions empty, faces pale as if they'd seen a ghost, or worse, as if they'd lost part of their souls down there. And then there were the whispers, faint, barely audible, almost like someone crying softly or whispering in pain. They seemed to come from behind that basement door, and no matter how much he tried to ignore them, he couldn't help but wonder what was going on below. He began to obsess over it. Something was calling to him, like a pull he couldn't resist, even though every part of his instincts told him to stay away. One night, after yet another strange occurrence, a symbol scrawled in red on one of the curtains, almost like a warning, he decided enough was enough. The rules, the whispers, the people disappearing to the basement, it all had to mean something. That night, when everything went quiet, he found the key in the supervisor's office. His heart pounded as he unlocked the door to the basement, and it swung open with an eerie creak, revealing a dark staircase that led downward into nothingness. The moment he stepped onto the stairs, he felt it. The air was different, heavy, thick with something he couldn't describe, an energy, a presence. He made his way down, step by careful step, the wooden planks groaning under his weight. The flashlight trembled in his hand, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness, revealing stone walls lined with strange symbols, some painted, others carved right into the rock. As he reached the bottom, the true extent of the basement revealed itself. Not a basement at all, but a series of tunnels, winding, narrow, like a labyrinth designed to get people lost. In the distance, flickering candlelight threw strange shadows on the walls, and he could hear the murmurs again, this time louder, unmistakably voices, an eerie chant in a language he did not recognize. As he approached, what he saw made his blood run cold. A group of people, including Diddy himself, gathered around a stone altar in the middle of a large room. They wore dark robes, and in the center of their circle was a massive book, its pages yellowed and worn, filled with symbols that looked ancient, sinister. They whispered in unison, and he could feel the vibrations of their voices in his chest, an unnatural sensation that felt like it was tugging at his soul. In the center of the room was a box, draped in a dark cloth. Whatever was inside seemed to be the focal point of the ritual. He could tell by the way the people moved, as if they were both worshiping and fearing it. Suddenly, Diddy raised his arms, and the chanting stopped. A cold silence fell over the room, and then, in a low, commanding voice, Diddy spoke of sacrifice, a necessary price for the power they craved. One of the robed figures pulled out a knife, curved, glinting in the candlelight, and that's when he knew he had to leave. Whatever was happening here, it was far worse than anything he could have imagined. What Michael found in the basement was only the start, and the fear that followed him upstairs grew even stronger. A warning too late to ignore. He turned to go, but his foot slipped, sending a small stone skittering across the floor. Heads turned, and he felt his blood freeze. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his shoulder, and he spun around, ready to fight, but it was Joshua, another guard. Joshua's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Without a word, he pulled him back, away from the scene, guiding him through the winding tunnels and up the stairs. As they emerged back into the mansion, Joshua whispered urgently, "You've got to get out. They know you were here. They'll come after you." From that night on, he knew he was in too deep. The whispers grew louder, and it felt like the mansion itself was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. The other staff seemed to know too. Their eyes avoided his, their faces full of pity and fear. Maria, the cook who used to smile and chat with him, now barely looked at him. The gardener, once friendly, now stayed far away. Joshua, his only ally, became more and more frantic, his warnings more dire. It was during another party, days later, that he noticed something he couldn't ignore. A group of guests, led by Diddy, moved toward the basement once more. They were different this time, their movements more mechanical, their eyes vacant. He followed at a distance, slipping into the shadows, his heart pounding as they disappeared behind the heavy door. The moment it closed, the whispers began again, louder this time, almost like screams. He knew he couldn't keep ignoring it. Whatever was happening down there, it wasn't just some confidential society ritual. It was something darker, something evil. Later that night, after the guests had left, he found a note slipped under his door. The paper was thick, the handwriting elegant. "You know too much. Be careful." The fear that had been building inside him finally overwhelmed him. Joshua's warnings, the strange looks from the staff, the rituals, it all pointed to one thing. He was in danger and there was no way out. He decided to confront Joshua. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He found Joshua in his small apartment, the place a mess of papers and photos, all connected by strings on a bulletin board. Joshua looked at him, his face hollow, dark circles under his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," Joshua said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not safe. None of us are." Joshua explained it all. The rituals were about control, absolute control. The people involved weren't just Hollywood elites. They were powerful figures from all walks of life, people who wanted to shape the world, to bend it to their will. The sacrifices, the chants, the strange symbols, they were all part of a pact, a promise of power in exchange for loyalty, and anyone who got in their way was dealt with permanently. Joshua handed him an envelope. "This is all I have, evidence, but not enough. You need to get out of town, find someone who can do something with this. I can't leave. They're watching me. If I try, they'll eliminate me." He took the envelope, his hands shaking. He knew Joshua was right. There was no going back now. He had seen too much. The days that followed were a blur. He could feel the eyes on him, could sense the danger closing in. The phone calls, the whispers, the shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. They were all reminders that he was being hunted. Even the other staff avoided him like the plague, and Joshua, once his only friend, had grown distant, his face a mask of fear. One night, he received another note, this time slipped under his door at home. It was a simple message: run. He knew it was his last chance. The mansion had become a prison, every corridor a reminder of what he had seen, every shadow a potential threat. He packed a bag, took the envelope Joshua had given him, and left. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay. As he walked away from the mansion, the weight of what he had seen bore down on him. The rituals, the sacrifices, the empty eyes of the guests. It was all too much. He knew he had to tell someone, had to find a way to stop it, but the fear was overwhelming. How could he fight something so powerful, so deeply rooted in the fabric of society? The rain poured down as he made his way through the dark streets, the city a blur around him. He looked at the envelope, the evidence that could bring it all down, and felt a surge of determination. He couldn't let fear control him, couldn't let the darkness win. He had to try, even if it cost him everything. The more he learned, the more he saw this wasn't a small problem, and the danger was getting closer. Alone against the faces of wealth. He knew one thing for certain: he could never go back. The mansion, the tunnels, the rituals, they were all behind him now, but the fight was just beginning. He had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The world needed to know what was happening in the shadows, needed to see the darkness that hid behind the glittering facade of wealth and power. And he would do whatever it took to bring that darkness into the light. As he walked away, one question echoed in his mind. How far would he go to do what was right? And how far would those in power go to keep their things hidden? Only time would tell, but he knew one thing. He was ready to find out. He didn't sleep that night. His mind was overwhelmed by the flashes of what he had seen. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the dark, flickering images of the tunnels, the robes, the candlelight, and the vacant eyes of the people gathered around that altar. His heart pounded, every nerve in his body alive with a mixture of terror and determination. He knew that running was not enough. If he didn't expose what was happening beneath that mansion, he would never truly be free of it. The danger would follow him everywhere he went. He packed a bag with essentials, clothes, food, a flashlight, and a few basic tools. He had no idea where he was going, but he had to start somewhere. He grabbed the envelope Joshua had given him and left his small apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to be careful. He had to make sure he wasn't being followed. The rain poured down as he made his way through the dark streets, and he kept to the shadows, moving quickly, his eyes darting around nervously. He made his way to the outskirts of the city. He needed somewhere quiet, somewhere he could gather his thoughts and figure out his next move. He found an old, abandoned house on the edge of town, its windows boarded up, the garden overgrown. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. He forced open a side door and stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The place smelled damp and musty, and there was dust covering every surface. But it was a place to hide. It was safe for now. He sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, and opened the envelope. His hands shook as he pulled out the contents. A series of photographs, some documents, all covered in strange symbols. There were pictures of the mansion, of the guests. Some of the faces were familiar from the parties he had seen. There were pictures of the basement, the tunnels, and even of the altar itself. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the extent of what Joshua had given him. This was proof, evidence of something dark and sinister, something that needed to be exposed. He spent hours going through the contents of the envelope. He studied each photograph, each document, trying to piece together the story. It was clear that the rituals were about power, about control. The people involved were from all walks of life: politicians, celebrities, businessmen. They were the people who shaped the world, who made the decisions that affected everyone. And they were willing to do anything to maintain that power, even if it meant making sacrifices, literal sacrifices. The more he read, the more he realized just how deep this went. It wasn't just about Diddy or his mansion. It was a network, a web that stretched across the world, connecting the powerful and the elite in a pact that was centuries old. As the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, he knew what he had to do. He had to get this information to someone who could do something with it, someone who could expose the truth. He couldn't do it alone. He needed help. He thought of going to the police, but he knew that the people involved were too powerful. They had connections everywhere. He needed to find someone who was outside of their influence, someone who was willing to take the risk to bring this all to light. He spent the next few days hiding out in the abandoned house, trying to come up with a plan. He knew he couldn't stay in one place for too long. The people involved in the rituals would be looking for him, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. He needed to keep moving, stay one step ahead of them. He started to make contact with people, journalists, activists, anyone who might be able to help. He used payphones, never staying in one place for too long, always looking over his shoulder. Every step Michael took showed him that sharing the truth might cost him everything, even his life, when the fight became too real. One night, as he was making his way back to the abandoned house, he noticed a car parked down the street. It was dark, the windows tinted, and it didn't belong. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned quickly, ducking into an alleyway. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as he pressed himself against the wall, peering around the corner. The car stayed where it was, but he knew they were watching him. They had found him. He had to leave. He made his way through the back streets, moving quickly, trying to put as much distance between himself and the car as possible. He had to find somewhere else to hide, somewhere they wouldn't be able to find him. He thought of Joshua, wondered if he was still safe, if he was still alive. He couldn't go to him. He couldn't risk leading them to Joshua. He was on his own. He found a small motel on the edge of town. It was run down, the kind of place where no one asked questions. He paid in cash and took a room at the back, away from the road. He locked the door behind him and pulled the curtains closed, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had to figure out his next move. He couldn't keep running forever. That night, he sat on the bed, the envelope in his hands. He knew that what he had could bring down some of the most powerful people in the world, but it also put him in incredible danger. He had to be smart about this. He had to find the right person, someone who could take this information and use it to expose the truth. He thought of the journalists he had contacted, the people who had listened to his story, who had promised to help. He hoped they were still out there, that they hadn't been silenced. The next morning, he left the motel early. He had a meeting with a journalist, a woman named Sarah who had shown genuine interest in his story. She had agreed to meet him at a diner on the other side of town. He made his way there, taking a circuitous route, making sure he wasn't being followed. The diner was small, the kind of place where people came for a cheap breakfast and a cup of coffee. He spotted Sarah at a booth in the back, her eyes scanning the room nervously. He slid into the booth across from her, his eyes darting around the room. "Did anyone follow you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't think so," she said. He pulled the envelope from his bag and slid it across the table. "This is everything," he said. "You need to get this out there. People need to know what's happening." Sarah opened the envelope, her eyes widening as she looked at the photographs, the documents. This is huge," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded. "You have to be careful," he said. "These people, they'll do anything to protect their things. They'll come after you, just like they're coming after me." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll get this out there." As he left the diner, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had done what he could. He had given the evidence to someone who could use it, someone who could expose the truth. But he knew it wasn't over. The people involved in the rituals wouldn't stop. They would come after him, and they would come after Sarah. He had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of them. He spent the next few weeks on the run, never staying in one place for too long, always looking over his shoulder. He knew they were still out there, still looking for him. He could feel their presence, could sense the danger closing in. But he also knew that he had done the right thing. He had exposed the truth, had taken the first step towards bringing down the people who hid behind their wealth and power, who used their influence to control and manipulate. One night, as Michael sat in yet another rundown motel room, he turned on the television. The news was on, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw Sarah's face on the screen. She was standing in front of a camera, her voice steady as she spoke about the evidence Michael had given her. She was exposing the truth, bringing to light the darkness that had been hidden for so long. Michael felt a surge of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could win this fight. Michael took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. He would keep fighting, Keep exposing the truth no matter the cost. The world needed to know what was happening, needed to see the darkness that hid behind the glittering facade of wealth and power. And Michael would do whatever it took to bring that darkness into the light. Could Diddy's tunnels be just an eccentric addition to his mansion? Or do they hide something far darker, something the world isn't ready to know? Tell us your thoughts and remember to like and subscribe for more.